A millionaire invites a black beggar girl into his home, thinking it's just an act of kindness, but the moment she steps inside, something feels. The way she speaks, the way she looks at him. It stirs a past he's tried to forget. Then, she says two words that shake him to his core. Because this isn't just any girl. She's a child he never knew existed, carrying secrets that will unravel everything he thought he knew. How did she end up on the streets? And what happens when the truth comes out? The rain drummed against the windows of Hawthorne Estate, creating a steady rhythm that matched Ethan Hawthorne's troubled thoughts. He stood in his study, the crystal whiskey glass cool against his palm, watching droplets race down the massive bay window. The storm had cleared the streets, leaving them dark and empty, except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the wet pavement. His eyes drifted to the ornate gates of his property, where the old-fashioned street lamp cast a weak circle of yellow light. That's when he saw her, a small figure hunched beneath the lamp, shoulders curved inward against the biting wind. Her thin hoodie was plastered to her frame, offering little protection from the relentless downpour. Ethan took another sip of whiskey, trying to look away, but something about the girl kept drawing his attention back. Maybe it was the way she held herself, pride evident even in her misery. Or perhaps it was the familiar curve of her jaw, visible when lightning flashed across the sky. "James," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet study. The butler appeared instantly, as if he had been waiting just outside the door. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne?" Ethan gestured toward the window. "There's a girl out there. Bring her inside." James peered through the rain-streaked glass, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, sir." He hesitated for a moment. "Shall I prepare some hot food as well?" "Yes," Ethan nodded, still watching the figure by the gate. "And find some dry clothes." Through the window, Ethan observed James approaching the gate with a large black umbrella. The girl startled at first, taking a step back. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the wariness in her posture. James spoke to her for several minutes, his gentle manner eventually convincing her to follow him. When they entered the foyer, Ethan could finally see her clearly. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark skin and features that stirred something in his memory. Her clothes were worn but clean, suggesting someone who took pride in appearance despite limited means. "I don't need charity," she said immediately, her voice stronger than her shivering frame suggested. Water pooled at her feet on the marble floor, but she stood as if she were on solid ground. "This isn't charity," Ethan replied from the study doorway. "It's basic human decency. James will show you where you can change." The girl's eyes darted around the foyer, taking in the crystal chandelier, the sweeping staircase, the oil paintings in gilded frames. Her expression hardened. "I won't be indebted to you." "No debt," Ethan assured her, keeping his distance. Something about her fierce independence struck a chord within him. "Just dry clothes and a hot meal if you'd accept them." James stepped forward, holding out a bundle of clothing. "The bathroom is just down that hall, miss. I can have your clothes dried while you eat." She hesitated, looking between James's kind face and Ethan's careful distance. Finally, hunger or exhaustion won out, and she accepted the clothes with a slight nod. When she emerged later, wearing simple but expensive clothes that hung slightly loose on her frame, James led her to the dining room. The table was set for two, steam rising from bowls of hot soup. Ethan sat at one end while she perched stiffly in a chair near the middle, as if ready to flee at any moment. "May I know your name?" Ethan asked, watching as she picked up her spoon with careful precision. "Ava," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "Ava Munro." "What brings you to this neighborhood, Ava?" She stirred her soup slowly, deliberating over her answer. "Looking for answers," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a mother. She died last year." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. There was something in her voice, a mixture of love and loss, strength and sorrow, that made Ethan's hand tighten around his whiskey glass. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "Your mother's name?" Ava's knuckles went white around her fork. For a moment, she seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Then, still not looking at him, she murmured, "Maria Monroe." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. His whiskey glass froze halfway to his lips, his fingers clenching around it so hard he feared it might shatter. Maria Monroe. The name he had tried so hard to forget, tried to bury beneath decades of carefully constructed indifference. In his peripheral vision, he saw James go completely still, the butler's usual composure cracking for just a moment before he regained control. But Ethan couldn't look away from Ava. From the proud tilt of her chin, the familiar curve of her cheekbone, the eyes that he now realized were exactly like her mother's. Maria Monroe. The memories he had locked away came rushing back. Summer afternoons filled with laughter, secret meetings in the garden, promises whispered under starlit skies. And then the harsh words of his father, the threats, the choices he had made out of cowardice disguised as duty. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand as lightning flashed outside, illuminating Ava's face in stark relief. In that brief moment, she was the mirror image of her mother, and Ethan felt the weight of 20 years of guilt crash down upon him all at once. The dining room was eerily quiet except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. Shadows danced across the dark wood paneling as Ava continued to eat slowly, methodically, her eyes fixed on her bowl. She could feel the weight of Ethan's distress filling the room like a heavy fog. Ethan hadn't touched his food. His weathered hands rested on either side of his plate as he stared unseeing at the elaborate place setting before him. His mind had drifted far from the present moment, back through the decades to a time when this very dining room had been filled with different sounds. Quiet laughter, whispered conversations, the rustle of a maid's uniform. Maria Monroe. She had been so young then, barely 18, working summers alongside her mother in the Hawthorne mansion. Her smile could light up even the darkest corners of this old house. She moved through these rooms like sunshine, bringing warmth to the cold marble and making even the stern portraits seem less severe. The memory of her was so vivid it made his chest ache. He could almost see her now, sneaking through the kitchen door in the early morning light, her uniform crisp and neat, her eyes bright with determination. She had refused to let her circumstances define her, carrying herself with a dignity that put the society women who visited the estate to shame. "Excuse me," Ethan said abruptly, pushing back from the table. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Ava's head snapped up, but he was already turning away, unable to bear the sight of Maria's eyes in this stranger's face. He moved quickly through the familiar corridors of his home, his footsteps echoing off the walls until he reached his private study. The door closed behind him with a solid thud, and he leaned against it, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. After a moment, he crossed to his desk, an antique piece that had belonged to his father. The bottom right drawer stuck slightly as he pulled it open, just as it always had. His hands trembled as he reached past old documents and forgotten correspondence to the very back of the drawer. The photograph was exactly where he had left it, tucked inside a worn envelope. The black and white image was slightly faded now, but Maria's radiance remained undimmed by time. She stood in the mansion's garden, caught in a moment of laughter, her head thrown back and her face alive with joy. He remembered taking this picture, remembered how the summer breeze had played with her dress, how the sunshine had caught in her hair. They had been so young, so foolish, so certain that love could conquer all. He had been 22, fresh out of college and already beginning to take his place in the family business. She was the daughter of their housekeeper, working summers to save money for nursing school. Their worlds should never have intersected, but they did. It started with simple things, a shared smile across a crowded room, a brief conversation in the garden, a moment of connection over a dropped stack of linens. Before he knew it, they were meeting in secret corners of the estate, sharing whispered conversations and stolen kisses. She told him about her dreams of becoming a nurse, of helping people. He shared his fears about living up to his father's expectations. But Augustus Hawthorne had found out. Ethan's hands clenched around the photograph as he remembered his father's cold fury, the threats, the ultimatums, the family legacy, the business empire, the social standing. All of it would be destroyed if Ethan continued this foolishness with a maid's daughter. He had chosen wrong. He knew that now, had known it even then. But he had been weak, afraid of his father, afraid of losing everything he had been raised to value. So he had done nothing when Maria and her mother were dismissed, had said nothing when they disappeared from his life. There had been a letter, he remembered suddenly. Years later, a single envelope with Maria's neat handwriting. He had never opened it, too caught up in his guilt and shame, too afraid of what it might say. He had buried it away with the photograph and tried to forget. Ethan's legs felt unsteady as he made his way back to the dining room. Ava was still there, her bowl empty now, her posture rigid with tension. James stood quietly in the corner, his face carefully blank but his eyes watchful. "Where did you grow up?" Ethan asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Ava's eyes met his, challenging. "South Side, with my mother." The South Side, one of the poorest areas of the city. The thought of Maria there, of this girl growing up there, made his stomach turn. "Did she ever mention me?" "No!" Ava's jaw tightened, her words sharp as broken glass. "And why would she?" The bitterness in her voice cut deep. She didn't know the full story, couldn't know it, but somehow she blamed him anyway. Perhaps she had seen it in her mother's eyes over the years, had sensed the old wound that never fully healed. Ethan turned to James, who had been watching the exchange with knowing eyes. "James, I need you to find out everything you can about Maria Monroe's life after she left here. Everything." "Of course, sir," James replied quietly, but there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew more than he was saying. Ethan looked back at Ava, at this living reminder of his greatest mistake. She sat straight-backed in her chair, proud and defiant despite her circumstances, just like her mother had been. The truth was there in every line of her face, in the familiar set of her jaw, in the way she held herself against the world. He didn't need James's investigation to know that the truth would destroy him. It was already destroying him, piece by piece, with every passing moment he spent in the presence of Maria Monroe's daughter, their daughter. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up as midnight crept closer. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, illuminating Ethan's study in brief, harsh bursts. He sat in his leather chair, unable to find peace, his mind racing with possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider before. Ava's face haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maria's features reflected in her daughter's determined expression. The resemblance was undeniable, but it was more than that. It was the way she held herself, the fierce pride in her eyes, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from within. Just like Maria. The thought that had been growing in his mind since dinner now consumed him entirely. Could Ava be his daughter? The timing would make sense. Maria had disappeared from his life without explanation, and now here was this young woman carrying echoes of the past in every gesture. James appeared in the doorway, silent as always. He didn't need to announce himself. Ethan had learned to sense his presence over their many years together. "James," Ethan's voice was hoarse. "I need you to contact Richard Graves. Tell him I don't care what time it is. I need him here by morning. I need to know everything about Maria Monroe's life after she left this house." "Of course, sir." James hesitated, something unusual for him. "If I may, I believe Mr. Graves is already aware of the situation. He has been monitoring certain aspects of the Monroe family's circumstances for some time." Ethan's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "Your father, sir. Before his death, he had standing orders regarding Maria Monroe and her daughter. Mr. Graves was tasked with keeping them at a distance." The implications of this statement hit Ethan like a physical blow. His father had known. All these years, Augustus Hawthorne had known something that had been deliberately kept from his own son. The night passed slowly, each minute dragging by as Ethan waited. He didn't even attempt to sleep. Instead, he paced his study, watching the storm gradually fade into a gray dawn. Richard Graves arrived precisely at 7, carrying a thick manila envelope. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of unremarkable face that made him perfect for his profession. Without ceremony, he laid out the contents of the envelope across Ethan's desk. What emerged was a life documented in cold, clinical detail. Hospital records showing Maria's pregnancy. Rental applications for a series of increasingly run-down apartments in the South Side. Employment records from diners, cleaning services, and convenience stores. School records for Ava, showing a bright student who could never quite afford the opportunities she deserved. But it was the letters that broke him. Dozens of them, spanning years, all in Maria's familiar handwriting. All addressed to him, all unopened. The first one was dated just weeks after she had left the estate. With trembling hands, Ethan opened it, unfolding the delicate paper that still carried a ghost of Maria's perfume. "Dearest Ethan," it began, "I don't know how to tell you this, but I must try. I'm pregnant. Please don't think I'm asking for anything. I know your position, I know what your father threatened. I just believe you have the right to know. I will understand if you can't respond, but please know that I don't regret a single moment we shared." Letter after letter revealed Maria's journey, her hope fading with each unanswered plea. Her determination to give their child the best life she could manage alone. Her struggles with poverty, with illness, with a system that seemed designed to keep her down. The final letter was dated just months before her death. "Ava is so much like you," she had written. "She has your mind, your way of seeing the world. Sometimes when she smiles, I see you as you were before the weight of your family's expectations crushed your spirit. I hope wherever you are, you found what you were looking for. I hope it was worth it." Ethan's vision blurred as the truth became devastatingly clear. His father had intercepted every letter, had systematically erased Maria from his life, ensuring that Ethan would never know about his child. While he had lived in luxury, building an empire he never truly wanted, Maria had struggled just to survive. She had died from a treatable illness, unable to afford the medical care that might have saved her life. The sound of the study door opening made him look up. Ava stood in the doorway, her expression changing from curiosity to shock as she took in the scene before her. Her eyes fell on the scattered photographs, the medical records, and finally the letters. Before Ethan could stop her, she had picked up one of the unopened envelopes. Her hands shook as she read her mother's words. "Ethan, please. I don't want money. I just want you to know I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Ava's fingers clenched around the letter, crumpling the paper. With deliberate movements, she closed the file containing her mother's life, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You knew," she whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "No, I swear I didn't." Ethan stood, reaching out instinctively, but Ava stepped back from his gesture. Her face hardened into an expression he recognized. It was the same look Maria had given him the last time he had seen her, a look of disappointment and judgment that had haunted him for decades. "You had a choice," Ava said, each word precise and cutting. "And you chose power over us." Before Ethan could respond, she turned and walked out, slamming the study door behind her with enough force to make the family portraits on the walls rattle in their frames. The next day, the morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of the guest room as Ava methodically folded her worn clothes. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as she packed the few belongings she had brought with her into her threadbare backpack. The mansion's opulence felt suffocating now, every gilded frame and crystal chandelier a reminder of what her mother had been denied. From the doorway, Ethan watched her, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the plush carpet. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came. What could he possibly say to make this right? Every explanation felt inadequate in the face of decades of absence. "You don't have to leave," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava's hands stilled for a moment, but she didn't turn around. "Actually, I do." Her voice was steady, controlled. "I won't stay in the house of a man who chose wealth over his own child." Ethan stepped into the room, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I had these rushed." He placed the DNA test results on the bed beside her backpack. "If you'll just look..." A bitter laugh escaped Ava's lips as she finally turned to face him. "I don't need a test to know what kind of man you are." Her eyes, so like Maria's, burned with contempt. "The proof is in every struggle my mother faced alone. Every night she worked double shifts to keep food on our table." "Please," Ethan's voice cracked. "There's something you need to know about your grandfather, about Augustus." He moved to the antique desk in the corner, pulling out a stack of yellowed envelopes. Each one bore Maria's careful handwriting and, more tellingly, the distinctive red seal of Augustus Hawthorne. "My father intercepted every letter she sent. He made sure I never knew about you." His hands trembled as he held out the letters. "I was a coward about many things, but this I didn't know." Ava's expression flickered with uncertainty as she took in the unopened envelopes, each one dated and marked with her grandfather's seal. She reached out slowly, taking one from the stack. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingers, like it might crumble from the weight of its undelivered truth. "I'll take the test," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Not because I want to stay, but because I want proof before I walk away for good." The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Ava remained in the mansion, but she might as well have been a ghost. She took her meals in her room, avoided the common areas, and spoke to no one except James when absolutely necessary. The vast house seemed to expand around their silence, each room holding the weight of unspoken words. One afternoon, as Ava was making her way back to her room, James appeared silently beside her in the hallway. His usual stoic expression softened slightly as he spoke. "You should know something, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice low as if sharing a secret. "In all my years of service, Mr. Hawthorne has never taken anyone in. Not once. You are the first person he's ever invited to stay." Ava absorbed this information without comment, but later that evening she found herself drawn to the music room. The grand piano stood in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the warm lamplight. Without thinking, she sat down and lifted the cover. Her fingers found the keys naturally, muscle memory taking over as she began to play. It was a piece her mother had taught her, one of the few things Maria had brought with her from her time at the mansion. The melody filled the room, bittersweet and haunting. From the doorway, Ethan stood transfixed. The sight of Ava at the piano, her posture exactly like Maria's had been, made his chest ache. He remembered countless evenings spent in this very room, watching Maria play this same piece, both of them young and foolish enough to believe love could conquer anything. He didn't realize he had made a sound until Ava's hands stilled on the keys. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed, acknowledging his presence. "Your mother used to play that same song," he said softly. "I know." Ava's response was barely audible. "She taught me everything she knew about music. It was the only thing she had left from her time here." The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief, though each mourned differently. Ava for the mother she had lost, Ethan for the love he had let slip away. Days later, the DNA test results arrived in a plain white envelope. Ethan's hand shook as he held it in his study, though he already knew what it would say. Ava stood across from him, her face carefully blank as she watched him break the seal. His eyes scanned the document, though the words blurred together. Only one line stood out clearly. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. He looked up at Ava, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You are my daughter." Ava's expression remained unreadable as she crossed the room. Without a word, she took the envelope from his trembling hands, folded it carefully, and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of confirmed truth. Days later, the morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Hawthorne mansion, casting long shadows across the empty hallways. 3 days had passed since the DNA test confirmed what they both already knew, and the silence in the house had grown thick enough to touch. The usual bustle of James's careful footsteps and the distant sounds of household maintenance only emphasized the heavy quiet between father and daughter. Ava remained in her guest room most of the time, emerging only for necessities. The room had become her sanctuary and her prison all at once. She spent hours staring out the window, watching the manicured gardens below, thinking about her mother tending to those same flowers decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now lived in luxury, but it felt hollow without her mother to share it with. Ethan paced the halls like a ghost, his usual commanding presence diminished by uncertainty. In board meetings, he could silence a room with a single word. In mergers and acquisitions, his strategy was legendary. But here, in his own home, facing his own daughter, he felt completely powerless. He found himself walking past her door several times a day, each time lifting his hand to knock, then letting it fall again. The sound of her moving around inside would make him pause, hoping she might emerge, but she never did. During meals, which Ava now took in her room, Ethan sat alone at the massive dining table, pushing food around his plate. James watched his employer's distress with growing concern. "Perhaps, sir," James suggested one evening as he cleared away another barely touched dinner, "you might give Miss Monroe some space." Ethan looked up sharply. "Space? She's had 19 years of space, James. If I may speak freely, sir." James's tone was gentle but firm. At Ethan's nod, he continued, "She's not looking for a father. She's looking for a reason to hate you less." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, the truth of it settling heavily on his shoulders. Still, he tried. When he caught glimpses of her in the hallway, he would attempt conversation. "Did you sleep well?" he would ask. Or, "Is there anything you need?" Ava's responses, when they came at all, were clipped and cold. "Fine." "No." Sometimes just a slight shake of her head before she disappeared again. On the fourth evening, something changed. Ava ventured out of her room later than usual, when the mansion was at its quietest. She found herself drawn to the library, a vast room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes. The smell of old books and polished wood reminded her of the public library where her mother used to take her after school. She didn't notice Ethan at first, sitting in one of the wing chairs near the fireplace. He watched silently as she ran her fingers along the spines of books, reading titles in the dim lamplight. Her touch was gentle, almost reverent, just like Maria's had been. "Do you like to read?" he asked softly, trying not to startle her. Ava's hand stilled on a book, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she pulled the volume from the shelf, opening it carefully. There, on the inside cover, was a familiar signature. Maria Monroe, written in elegant cursive. "She never told me she liked to read," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. She traced her mother's signature with her fingertip, as if trying to touch a piece of her past. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions. Finally, Ava turned to face him, still holding the book close to her chest like a shield. "How did you meet her?" The question came out sharp, demanding. Ethan shifted in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "She was 16. Her mother worked here as a housekeeper. Maria would help sometimes, during summer breaks from school. She loved the library most of all." He gestured to the room around them. "She would stay late reading whatever she could get her hands on." "Did you love her?" Ava's voice cracked slightly on the word love. "Yes," the answer came without hesitation. "She was the only person who ever saw me as just Ethan, not as a Hawthorne heir." "If you loved her," Ava's voice rose, anger seeping through, "why didn't you fight for her? When your father found out, why didn't you stand up to him? Why didn't you choose her?" Each question came faster than the last, years of built-up pain spilling out. Ethan stood slowly, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his past choices. He moved to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond, but seeing only memories of Maria's face the last time he saw her. "Because I was a coward," he admitted, his voice rough with regret. "I had never stood up to my father before. I didn't know how. When he threatened to destroy Maria's family, to make sure her mother never worked again, to use his influence to ruin any chance of a future for her." He trailed off, the excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I told myself I was protecting her by letting her go. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I was too afraid to lose everything I'd been raised to value. Money, position, power." He turned back to face Ava. finding her watching him with an expression that mixed disgust with something else, perhaps pity. "You want to know the worst part?" he continued, needing to get it all out. "After my father died, I could have looked for her. I could have made it right. But I convinced myself it was too late, that too much time had passed. I buried myself in work, in deals and acquisitions, building an empire I didn't even want anymore." Ava finally met his gaze fully, her eyes, so like her mother's, filled with a cold clarity. "You still are," she said quietly. "What?" "A coward." She placed Maria's book carefully back on the shelf, her movements deliberate and final. "Nothing's changed. You're still hiding behind excuses, still trying to buy your way out of guilt." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the library, leaving Ethan alone with the ghosts of his past and the crushing weight of her judgment. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, each step an echo of his failure. The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows through the study windows, illuminating the stern face of Augustus Hawthorne in the portrait that had dominated the room for decades. Ethan sat at his mahogany desk, his coffee growing cold beside him as he stared up at his father's painted expression. Those eyes seemed to judge him even now, years after death. He remembered standing in this same spot as a young man, trembling before his father's wrath when Augustus had discovered his relationship with Maria. Now, looking at that same imperious face, Ethan felt something different. Not fear, but anger. Anger at his own cowardice, anger at the system that had allowed his father to separate him from Maria, and anger at himself for never fighting back. His gaze shifted to the papers spread across his desk. Company reports, stock holdings, trust documents. The Hawthorne empire, built on generations of privilege and exclusion. His fingers drummed against the polished wood as a decision crystallized in his mind. If Ava was his daughter, and there was no doubt she was, then she deserved more than just his guilt. She deserved her birthright. Without hesitation, he pressed the intercom button. "James, get me Harrison from PR immediately." Within hours, the machinery of a major press announcement was in motion. The grand conference room at Hawthorne Tower filled with journalists, cameras, and curious executives. The air hummed with speculation. Ethan Hawthorne rarely called press conferences, and never with such urgency. Ethan stood at the podium, his usual commanding presence amplified by purpose. The cameras flashed as he cleared his throat, his voice steady and clear. For decades, the Hawthorne name has represented power, tradition, and legacy. Today, I'm here to speak about that legacy, and to correct a historic wrong. He paused, meeting the curious gazes before him. "I am announcing that my daughter, Ava Monroe, is the sole heir to the Hawthorne empire." The room erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Executives exchanged alarmed glances. Photographers' cameras clicked frantically. "Miss Monroe is my biological daughter, confirmed by DNA testing. She will be taking her rightful place as the heir to Hawthorne Enterprises with immediate effect." The chaos that followed was predictable. Social media exploded with the news. Business channels ran continuous coverage. Old money families who had long courted alliance with the Hawthornes expressed their shock and dismay in carefully worded statements that barely concealed their racism. In the executive suite, the board of directors demanded an emergency meeting. These men, all white and well past 60, had been his father's contemporaries. They sat around the massive conference table, faces red with indignation. "This is unprecedented, Ethan," Gerald Matthews, the lead director, sputtered. "The implications for shareholder confidence are not your concern," Ethan cut him off coolly. "The choice is simple, gentlemen. Either accept my daughter as my heir, or tender your resignations. I'm not particularly interested in which you choose." "But she's—" another director began. "Choose your next words very carefully, Richard," Ethan warned, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the room. Meanwhile, in her room at the mansion, Ava watched the coverage with growing disbelief. Her face was plastered across every news channel. Reporters dissected her background, her mother's history, speculated about her qualifications and character. The words illegitimate heir and scandal were repeated ad nauseum. She found Ethan in his study, still fielding calls from business associates and lawyers. When he saw her, he quickly ended his conversation. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What I should have done from the beginning," Ethan replied, standing to face her. "Acknowledged you as my daughter by throwing me to the wolves?" Ava gestured at the television screen where her face was still being displayed. "You think money fixes everything?" "No," Ethan said firmly, moving around his desk. "But power can make things right. Don't you see? This is how we ensure you're never erased like Maria was. This gives you a seat at the table." "A seat at the table?" Ava laughed bitterly. "Your table? The same table where men like you and your father make decisions about people's lives? Where you decide who matters and who doesn't?" "Ava, no!" She cut him off, her voice rising. "You don't get it. You think you're making up for the past, but you're just doing what you've always done, making decisions about my life without asking what I want." "Then tell me what you want," Ethan pleaded. Ava's eyes flashed with anger. "You think I want your world? I don't. I don't want your money, your power, or your guilt. I came here looking for answers about my mother, not to become another pawn in your game of legacy." She turned sharply, her footsteps echoing through the study as she stormed out, leaving Ethan standing alone. The portrait of Augustus Hawthorne loomed over him as he sank back into his chair, wondering if in his attempt to right one wrong, he had committed another. The sound of reporters gathered outside the gates filtered through the windows, their presence a reminder that there would be no easy retreat from the path he had chosen. In trying to give Ava everything, he might have lost her completely. The shatter of glass pierced the midnight silence of the Hawthorne mansion. The sound echoed through the vast hallways, followed by the dull thud of something heavy hitting the study floor. Ethan, who had been working late, jerked back from his desk as shards of glass sprayed across the Persian rug. James burst through the door seconds later. "Sir, are you all right?" Ethan nodded, already moving toward the broken window. A brick lay among the glittering fragments of glass, a piece of paper tied to it with twine. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the note. 3 words were scrawled in angry black letters. "She doesn't belong." The security team swarmed the grounds within minutes, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. But whoever had thrown the brick was long gone, leaving only footprints in the wet grass that disappeared at the street. Ava appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "What happened?" Before Ethan could hide the note, she crossed the room and snatched it from his hands. Her face hardened as she read the message, but she said nothing, simply crumpling the paper and dropping it into the wastebasket. The next morning brought fresh attacks, these ones printed in black and white. Headlines screamed across newspapers and news sites. "Hawthorne heir, con artist in disguise. Sources question DNA results in Hawthorne scandal. Is Ava Monroe running the greatest inheritance scam in history?" Ava sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone. Each swipe revealed another accusation, another insinuation, that she was nothing but a clever fraud, taking advantage of a wealthy old man. The whispers weren't just online. She could hear them in the hallways, see them in the sidelong glances from house staff who had worked for the Hawthornes for decades. "Don't read that garbage," Ethan said, watching her from across the table. He turned to James, who stood nearby. "Double the security detail. I want cameras at every entrance and guards patrolling 24/7. "Very well, sir," James replied, but his eyes flickered to Ava with concern. She pushed away from the table. "So I'm supposed to live in a prison now?" "It's for your protection," Ethan insisted. "Protection from what? The truth?" She gestured at her phone. "They're right about one thing. I don't belong here." Before Ethan could respond, James entered with a grave expression. "Sir, Mr. Barrett is on the phone. He says it's urgent." Ethan's face darkened at the mention of Reginald Barrett, his father's oldest friend and confidant. The call was brief but explosive. Barrett had filed a legal challenge questioning Ava's claim to the estate, citing suspicious circumstances, and demanding an investigation into the DNA results. "He's trying to protect the Hawthorne legacy," Ethan explained to Ava afterward, his voice tight with anger. "He thinks you'll destroy everything my father built." "Maybe I will," Ava replied coldly, grabbing her jacket. I'm going out." "Ava, wait!" But she was already gone, slipping past the security guards at the gate. She needed to escape the suffocating weight of the Hawthorne world, if only for a few hours. Her feet carried her to her old neighborhood, to the familiar streets where she and her mother had built a life with nothing but love and determination. The corner store where Maria used to buy groceries on credit during tough times was still there. The old basketball court where Ava had spent countless afternoons watching kids play while doing her homework still echoed with the sound of bouncing balls. Everything looked smaller now, worn around the edges, but it felt real in a way the mansion never could. Lost in memories, she didn't notice the footsteps behind her until it was too late. As she turned down an alley, a shortcut she'd taken 100 times before, 3 masked men stepped out of the shadows. 2 more appeared behind her, blocking her escape. "Well, well," one of them sneered, his voice muffled by a black ski mask. "Look who thinks she's too good for the neighborhood now." Ava backed away, her heart pounding. "I don't want any trouble." "Should have thought of that before you tried playing princess," another man spat. "Go back to where you came from." One of them lunged forward, grabbing for her arm. Ava twisted away, but her back hit the brick wall. She was trapped. The screech of tires cut through the tension. A black SUV skidded to a halt at the entrance of the alley, its headlights flooding the space with harsh light. The driver's door flew open, and Ethan stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow. 2 security guards flanked him, their presence radiating quiet menace. Ava watched in stunned silence as her father moved to stand between her and her attackers. There was something different about him now. Gone was the guilt-ridden man who couldn't meet her eyes. In his place stood someone who reminded her just for a moment of her mother's strength when facing down the world's cruelty. The study felt different now, smaller somehow as Ava sat in one of the leather chairs, her hands still trembling slightly. The memory of those masked men in the alley kept replaying in her mind, but it wasn't their threats that unsettled her most. It was the sight of Ethan stepping between her and danger without hesitation. Ethan stood by the drink cart, his movements mechanical as he poured amber liquid into a crystal glass. The security team had efficiently handled the situation, but the tension hadn't left his shoulders. He took a long sip before turning to face her. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice grave. "These people, they won't stop until they've destroyed everything we're trying to build." Ava watched him, trying to reconcile this protective figure with the man who had abandoned her mother. "Why did you come after me?" "Because you're my daughter." The words came out simply, as if they explained everything. The next morning, Ethan walked into the Somerset Country Club, his presence causing an immediate stir among the usual crowd of wealthy patrons. He found Reginald Barrett exactly where he expected, at his regular table on the terrace, enjoying his morning coffee while reading the financial papers. "Reginald," Ethan's voice cut through the peaceful morning air. "We need to talk." Barrett looked up, his thin lips curving into a practiced smile. "Ethan, my boy, please, join me." He gestured to the empty chair across from him, acting as if nothing was amiss. Ethan remained standing. "Did you arrange it?" "Arrange what?" Barrett's eyes gleamed with false innocence. "The attack on my daughter." Ethan's words drew shocked gasps from nearby tables. Those men knew exactly where to find her. Barrett carefully folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Your daughter?" He said the word like it tasted bitter. "Come now, Ethan. We both know what she really is. An opportunist who's manipulated her way into your life. She's my flesh and blood. She will never be one of us, Ethan." Barrett's smile turned cold. "Even you know that. The sooner you accept it, the easier this will be for everyone." While Ethan confronted Barrett, Ava's phone rang with an unknown number. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Chen, a reporter from the Daily Chronicle. "Miss Monroe, I have information you need to see," the reporter said. "It's about your father, the real story." They met at a small coffee shop downtown, far from the Hawthorne mansion's watching eyes. Sarah Chen was younger than Ava expected, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She slid a manila folder across the table without preamble. "Before you open that," Sarah said, "you should know. This could change everything." Ava's hands shook as she opened the folder. The first document made her blood run cold, a legal form, dated months before her birth, with Ethan's signature clearly visible at the bottom. It was a voluntary termination of parental rights. Behind that was something even worse: correspondence between Augustus Hawthorne and Judge William Porter, discussing arrangements to seal all records of Ava's existence. The judge had agreed to bury any trace of her connection to the Hawthorne family. "How did you get these?" Ava's voice was barely a whisper. "Judge Porter died last month. His daughter found these while cleaning out his office." Sarah leaned forward. "Your father didn't just ignore you and your mother, Miss Monroe. He legally erased you." When Ethan returned to the mansion that evening, he found Ava waiting in his study. The folder lay open on his desk, its contents spread out like an accusation. "Explain this," she demanded, holding up the termination document with his signature. Ethan stepped closer, his face paling as he examined the paper. I never signed this." "Really? Because that's your signature. Right there, giving up any claim to me before I was even born." "Ava, please, I don't remember signing this. My father must have—" He trailed off, realizing how hollow the excuse sounded. "Must have what? Forged it?" Ava laughed bitterly. "And I suppose he forged all these too?" She gestured to the other documents. "The agreements with the judge? The orders to seal the records?" Ethan stood there speechless. The documents were real. He could see that clearly. But the signature— He remembered his father often having him sign stacks of papers, never questioning what they contained. Had this been among them? "I trusted you," Ava's voice cracked. "When you said you didn't know about me, I actually started to believe you. But this—" She picked up the folder, her hands trembling with rage. "You didn't just ignore us. You legally erased me." "Ava, please let me explain." "There's nothing to explain." She stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't need your name. I don't need your money. I'm done." She turned and walked out of the study, leaving Ethan standing among the scattered evidence of his father's, and perhaps his own, betrayal. By the time he gathered himself enough to follow her, she was already halfway up the grand staircase heading for her room. Within an hour, Ava had packed her few belongings into the same bag she'd arrived with. She descended the stairs with determined steps, her chin held high despite the tears threatening to fall. Ethan waited by the front door, his face a mask of anguish. As she passed him, Ava paused for just a moment. "You're just as much your father's son as I am his granddaughter," she said, then walked out into the night, leaving the Hawthorne mansion and all its secrets behind. The familiar streets of Southside welcomed Ava back like an old friend. The cracked sidewalks, the faded storefronts, and even the distant sound of sirens felt more like home than all the marble and gold of the Hawthorne mansion. She adjusted her backpack on her shoulder, its light weight a reminder of how little she truly needed. The evening air carried the scent of fried food from Lee's Corner Shop and the sweet aroma of fresh bread from Martinez Bakery. These smells, these sights, they were real, not like the artificial perfection of Ethan's world. Malik's cafe sat wedged between a laundromat and a secondhand bookstore, its weathered sign reading "Soul Food and Coffee" in peeling paint. Through the window, Ava could see him wiping down tables, his dreadlocks tied back neatly. The bell chimed as she pushed open the door. "Ava?" Malik straightened up, surprise written across his face. "Girl, where have you been? I've been seeing your face all over the news." She managed a weak smile. "It's a long story. Well, you know you always got a place here." He pulled her into a tight hug, and for the first time since leaving the mansion, Ava felt her shoulders relax. This was real friendship, not the calculated moves of high society. Malik set her up in the small apartment above the cafe. It wasn't much, just a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it felt honest. No pretense, no gilded cages. The next morning, Ava helped out in the cafe, falling easily into the rhythm of taking orders and serving coffee. But she couldn't escape the whispers and stares. Customers would glance at their phones, then at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. A group of regulars sat in the corner booth, their conversation carrying across the quiet cafe. "Can you believe she thought they'd actually accept her?" one woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Those people don't change. They just protect their own." "Heard she tried to scam the old man," another added. "But he caught on." Ava's hands trembled as she wiped down the counter, but she refused to show weakness. Let them talk. She didn't need their approval any more than she needed Ethan's money. Malik noticed her tension. "Hey," he said softly, "you don't have to be here if it's too much." "No," Ava squared her shoulders. "I'm done running. This is my life, my real life, not some fairy tale about lost princesses and redemption." Meanwhile, across town, the Hawthorne mansion had grown darker, colder. Ethan sat in his study, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on his desk. The curtains remained drawn, shutting out the afternoon sun. Papers lay scattered across the floor, news articles about Ava, old photographs, the damning documents that had driven her away. James entered silently, carrying a tray of food that would likely go untouched, just like breakfast and lunch. "Sir," he said gently, "you need to eat something." Ethan didn't look up. His fingers traced the edge of a framed photograph, Maria, young and beautiful, standing in the mansion's garden. Her smile held no hint of the betrayal to come. "I did this, James." Ethan's voice was hoarse. "Not just my father. Me. I chose this life over them." "You were young, sir. Your father—" "Stop." Ethan's hand tightened around his glass. "I'm tired of blaming him. I could have fought. I could have—" He trailed off, taking another long drink. James watched his employer, the man he'd served for decades, crumble under the weight of his choices. The proud, commanding presence that had dominated boardrooms was gone, replaced by a shadow of regret. "She's exactly like her mother," Ethan whispered more to himself than James. "That same fire, that same—" He couldn't finish the thought. The whiskey bottle emptied as night fell. Ethan remained in his chair, staring at Maria's photograph, seeing in it all the moments he'd thrown away, all the years he'd lost with his daughter. Across the city, Ava had found a small apartment of her own. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. She'd spent the day moving in her few belongings and picking up secondhand furniture from local shops. The space slowly began to feel like home, even with its peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. She was unpacking a box of books when she heard something slide under her door. The hallway was empty when she checked. On the floor lay a plain white envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph she'd never seen before. Her mother, young and radiant, stood beside Ethan in what looked like a garden. They were looking at each other, both smiling, both unaware of the camera. It was a moment of pure joy, captured before everything fell apart. Ava's hands shook as she turned the photograph over. Written in neat, precise handwriting were 7 words. "She would have wanted you to fight." Her heart pounded against her ribs. The handwriting wasn't Ethan's. She'd seen enough of his signature to know that. Someone else knew the truth about her parents, someone who had been there when this photo was taken. She stared at the image, at her mother's face frozen in time, wondering who else carried pieces of this story she thought she knew. In the polished mahogany conference room of the Hawthorne building's top floor, Ethan sat across from Philip Greer, his longtime attorney. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the thick stack of legal documents between them. The distant hum of traffic 50 stories below barely penetrated the soundproofed glass, creating an atmosphere of isolated power. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Ethan?" Philip adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his weathered face creased with concern. "Changing a will of this magnitude, there will be consequences." His fingers drummed nervously on the leather portfolio he'd brought, betraying his usual composure. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He picked up the fountain pen, its weight familiar in his hand after signing countless deals over the decades. "Remove Grayson completely. Every property, every share, every trust fund, all of it goes to Ava." His voice didn't waver, though his heart pounded with the magnitude of what he was doing. Philip leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his gray hair. Grayson has been your heir apparent for 20 years. The board expects him to take over. He's been trained for this his entire life. He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of their 30-year friendship. And that was my mistake, Ethan's voice was firm. I chose the wrong heir once before. I won't make that mistake again. His eyes fixed on the Manhattan skyline outside, buildings he'd helped shape over his lifetime. The lawyer began pulling out documents, his movements deliberate and careful. You understand this will start a war? Grayson won't go quietly. The board will fight this. Reginald Barrett already has a lawsuit pending. Each paper he placed before Ethan seemed to carry the weight of future battles. Let them come. Ethan grabbed the first document, signing his name with quick, decisive strokes. I've spent my whole life playing by their rules, Philip. Look where that got me. A lifetime of regret flashed behind his eyes as the pen scratched across the paper. Across town, in the wood-paneled study of Reginald Barrett's mansion, Grayson Hawthorne paced like a caged animal. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of agitation. The crystal decanter on the sidebar had been emptied, fueling his growing rage. He can't do this to me. Grayson's fist slammed against the mahogany desk. 20 years. 20 years I've given to that company, to him, and he throws me away for some girl from the streets? His voice cracked with emotion, betraying the depth of his betrayal. Reginald Barrett watched from his leather armchair, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. His lined face remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with calculated interest. The question is, my boy, what are you prepared to do about it? The soft clink of ice against crystal punctuated his words. Grayson stopped pacing. What do you mean? His breathing was heavy, face flushed with anger and too much scotch. I mean, Reginald set his glass down carefully, that I'm already challenging the girl's claim to the Hawthorne name. But a testimony from you, Ethan's trusted godson, about his declining mental state, that would be compelling. His thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. Understanding dawned on Grayson's face. You want me to testify that he's incompetent? The possibility hung in the air between them, tempting and terrible. I want you to help us protect the Hawthorne legacy from those who would destroy it. Reginald pulled out a document from his desk drawer. All you need to do is sign this affidavit stating that you've noticed concerning changes in Ethan's behavior. Paranoia, confusion, irrational decisions. His manicured finger tapped the signature line. Grayson took the paper, scanning its contents. His hands trembled slightly. And what do I get? The paper crinkled in his tightening grip. When this is over, you'll have what was always meant to be yours. Reginald's smile didn't reach his eyes. The company, the fortune, the name, all of it. He reached for the pen in his breast pocket, holding it out like an offering. Meanwhile, in a small diner on the south side, Ava sat across from Estelle, an elderly black woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. The mysterious photograph lay between them on the scratched Formica table. The evening crowd created a bubble of noise around them, offering a strange privacy in the public space. You knew my mother, Ava said softly. It wasn't a question. Her finger traced the edge of the photograph, as if touching it might somehow connect her to the woman in the image. Estelle nodded, her fingers ghosting over the photograph. I was there when this was taken. Your mama was so beautiful that day, so happy. She looked up at Ava. She never stopped loving him, you know, even after everything. Her voice carried decades of witnessed pain. Then why didn't she fight harder? Why didn't she make him listen? Ava's voice caught, the question she'd been asking herself since learning the truth. Oh, child, Estelle's voice was gentle. She did fight. Augustus Hawthorne made sure Ethan never saw those letters, but your mama, she wrote everything down. Every truth, every lie, every piece of evidence that could bring that man's empire down. Her weathered hand reached across to squeeze Ava's. Ava leaned forward. What letters? the diner's fluorescent lights reflected in her suddenly alert eyes. The ones Augustus tried to destroy. Estelle glanced around the diner before lowering her voice. But your mama was smart. She knew they'd try to erase her, so she kept copies, hidden them where only someone who knew her would think to look. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Where? Ava's heart pounded, the coffee between them forgotten and growing cold. Find the letters, Estelle whispered, squeezing Ava's hand. That's all I can say for now. But be careful, child. There are people who'd kill to keep those secrets buried. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened with worry. The sun had set by the time Ethan returned to his mansion. The moment he stepped into his study, he knew something was wrong. Papers littered the floor like fallen leaves. Books had been torn from shelves, their spines broken. His desk drawers hung open, their contents scattered. The smell of his own violated privacy hung in the air. But it was the safe that made his blood run cold. The heavy steel door gaped open, its contents missing. Decades of sensitive documents, contracts, evidence of his father's dealings, all gone. The emptiness seemed to mock him from the wall. A single piece of paper sat in the center of his desk, weighted down by a crystal paperweight. Ethan recognized Grayson's precise handwriting immediately. You should have picked me. The words stared back at him, a declaration of war. Ethan sank into his chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his office, understanding with terrible clarity that this was only the beginning. His hands shook as he reached for the phone, knowing that somewhere across the city Ava might already be in danger. The marble halls of the courthouse echoed with footsteps and whispers as people filed into the crowded courtroom. Camera flashes burst through the tall windows, catching glimpses of the drama about to unfold. Inside, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ava sat at the defendant's table, her back straight despite the weight of countless stares. She wore a simple navy dress, borrowed from a thrift store, but carried herself with quiet dignity. Beside her, Ethan looked older than his years, worry etched deep in the lines of his face. Across the aisle, Reginald Barrett's legal team spread out like an army in expensive suits. Their leather briefcases bulged with documents meant to destroy Ava's claim to the Hawthorne name. Reginald himself sat in the front row, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression one of practiced concern. Judge Margaret Chen entered, her black robe sweeping behind her. Court is now in session. Barrett versus Monroe, concerning the validity of Ethan Hawthorne's recent amendments to his will and the legitimacy of Ava Monroe's claim to the Hawthorne estate. Reginald's lead attorney, Maxwell Stewart, rose smoothly to his feet. His voice carried across the hushed courtroom. Your Honor, we intend to prove that Ms. Monroe's claim to the Hawthorne fortune is nothing more than an opportunistic grab for wealth by someone who, until recently, was living on the streets. Ava's fingers curled into fists under the table. She watched as Stewart painted a picture of her that made her stomach turn. This young woman, Stewart continued, gesturing toward Ava, appeared at Mr. Hawthorne's door on a rainy night, spinning tales of connection to a long-dead woman. And suddenly, she's named sole heir to billions. It stretches credibility, Your Honor. The morning wore on as Stewart called witness after witness. Former Hawthorne employees testified about never hearing of Maria Monroe. Social workers detailed Ava's time in poverty. Each statement felt like another brick in a wall being built between Ava and her birthright. Then Grayson took the stand. He looked different than the last time Ava had seen him, more polished if possible. His designer suit and carefully styled hair screamed old money and privilege, but it was his eyes that changed the most. Cold now, calculating. Mr. Hawthorne has been like a father to me, Grayson began, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. Which is why it pains me deeply to say this, but his behavior has become increasingly erratic over the past months. Ethan stiffened beside Ava. He's been paranoid, confused, Grayson continued, making impulsive decisions without consulting the board. The day he announced Ms. Monroe as his heir, he hadn't slept in days. He was drinking heavily. Objection, Ava's lawyer called out. Speculation. Overruled, Judge Chen responded. Continue, Mr. Hawthorne. Grayson leaned forward, his expression a perfect mask of concern. I believe my godfather is no longer capable of making sound decisions regarding his estate. This sudden change in his will? It's not just unusual, it's a sign of his declining mental state. When Ethan finally took the stand, his usual commanding presence seemed diminished under the harsh fluorescent lights. I am perfectly sound of mind, he stated firmly. Ava is my daughter. DNA tests prove it. She deserves her place in the Hawthorne legacy. Yet you signed documents decades ago, Stewart countered, relinquishing any parental rights. Documents you now claim you don't remember signing? Those signatures were forged by my father. Convenient, Stewart's smile was razor sharp, that the only person who could verify this claim is deceased. Judge Chen watched Ethan with growing skepticism. Mr. Hawthorne, your recent behavior does raise concerns about your decision-making capacity. Finally, Ava took the stand. The walk to the witness box felt like miles, but she kept her head high. She wouldn't let them see her fear. Stewart approached, his expensive shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. Ms. Monroe, isn't it true that you were homeless when you approached Mr. Hawthorne's house? Yes, Ava answered clearly. Because my mother died without health care she should have had access to. And isn't it convenient that you showed up at the home of one of the city's wealthiest men? Ava's voice grew stronger. I showed up because I had nowhere else to go. I didn't know who he was to me then. Yet now you claim entitlement to billions? Ava's eyes flashed. I claim the right to my own history. My mother's story was erased. I won't let you erase mine. The courtroom fell silent at her words. Even Stewart paused. Then Ava reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. And I have proof. Judge Chen leaned forward. What is that, Ms. Monroe? My mother's journal. She documented everything. Every meeting with Augustus Hawthorne. Every threat. Every bribe to keep quiet. Ava's hands were steady as she held up the book. She knew they would try to erase her, so she left evidence. The journal passed from hand to hand up to the judge. Judge Chen's eyes widened as she skimmed the pages. Your Honor, Stewart started, but the judge held up her hand. This is significant new evidence. Judge Chen closed the journal carefully. I'm calling a recess. I need time to review these documents properly. She banged her gavel. Court will reconvene in 1 week. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters rushed for the doors, eager to break the story. Ava gathered her things, her heart still pounding from her testimony. Outside, camera flashes nearly blinded her as she descended the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust toward her face. She kept walking, head high. You think this is over? A cold voice cut through the chaos. It's only the beginning. Ava turned. Reginald Barrett stood on the steps above her, a smirk playing at his lips. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of Maria's old apartment building. Ava stood in the dim hallway, key in hand, staring at the familiar scratches on apartment 3B's door. She hadn't been back here since the landlord cleared out her mother's things after her death. The lock clicked open with a rusty groan. Inside, the small one-bedroom apartment felt like a time capsule. Empty now, but the faded wallpaper and worn carpet held echoes of their life together. The musty smell of abandonment mixed with lingering traces of her mother's lavender perfume. Ava moved through the space slowly, her fingers trailing along the walls where family photos once hung. Every corner held a memory. The tiny kitchen where Maria taught her to cook rice and beans, the cramped living room where they'd huddle under blankets during winter when the heat went out. Where did you hide them, Mom? Ava whispered to the empty room. She started with the obvious places. Loose floorboards behind electrical outlets, inside light fixtures. Nothing. The closets yielded only dust and cobwebs. Under the sink, behind the radiator, beneath the windowsills, empty. In the bedroom, Ava faced her mother's old dresser. The wooden piece had seen better days, its dark finish worn away in places, one drawer missing its handle. She'd watched Maria get ready for work at this dresser countless mornings, applying drugstore lipstick in the clouded mirror. Methodically, Ava emptied each drawer. In the bottom one, tucked in the back corner, she found scraps of burned paper. Her heart jumped as she carefully unfolded them. Though mostly destroyed, she could make out fragments of her mother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Eth, the baby is... Please understand." Frustrated tears pricked at Ava's eyes. She slammed her fist against the wall beside the dresser, letting out a cry of anger and grief. The thin drywall shuddered, and something shifted. Ava froze. She knocked again, gentler this time. The sound was hollow. Her fingers found a slight gap in the baseboard. With trembling hands, she pried at the loose panel until it gave way, revealing a dark space behind the wall. Ava reached in, her breath catching as her fingers touched paper. She pulled out a stack of yellowed envelopes bound together with faded ribbon. The top one was addressed to Ethan Hawthorne in her mother's precise script. Below that was a leather-bound ledger, its pages stuffed with documents and newspaper clippings. But it was the last envelope that made her heart stop. Written in familiar handwriting, "For my daughter, Ava, to be opened when you're ready for the truth." Ava sank to the floor, the envelope heavy in her hands. The paper was thick, expensive, not the kind her mother could usually afford. With shaking fingers, she broke the seal. "My dearest Ava, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you and you finally discovered the truth about your father. I know you must have so many questions, so much anger. But before you let that anger consume you, there are things you need to understand. I loved your father deeply, and he loved me. What happened between us wasn't as simple as abandonment. Augustus Hawthorne was a powerful man who would stop at nothing to protect his empire, even if it meant destroying his own son's happiness. I've included proof of everything. The threats, the bribes, the illegal dealings Augustus used to maintain his power. I kept these records not for revenge, but for justice. Not just for me, but for every person the Hawthornes hurt in their pursuit of power. But most importantly, I kept them for you. You are stronger than I ever was, my beautiful girl. You have my fire and your father's determination. Don't let bitterness blind you to the truth. Ethan wasn't perfect. He made choices I couldn't forgive for a long time, but he was trapped in a cage of his father's making just as I was. I don't want you to hate him, Ava. I want you to fight for the truth, fight for justice. Fight for your place in this world that tried to erase both of us. Remember who you are, not just a Monroe, not just a Hawthorne, but my daughter, my greatest love, my highest hope. All my love, Mom." Ava clutched the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely now. Her mother's words washed over her like a healing balm, soothing years of hurt and confusion. She looked at the stack of evidence beside her. Proof of Augustus Hawthorne's crimes, proof of her mother's strength, proof of a truth too long buried. With newfound clarity, she pulled out her phone. The number she needed was still saved, though she'd never used it. Her finger hovered over Ethan's name for just a moment before pressing dial. He answered on the second ring. "Ava?" She took a deep breath, her mother's letter still pressed to her heart. "I found them." The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across Ava's small apartment. She sat cross-legged on her worn couch, surrounded by the scattered contents from behind the wall. Letters, documents, and newspaper clippings forming a paper fortress around her. But it was the sealed envelope in her hands that commanded her complete attention. Her mother's handwriting stared back at her. "For my daughter, Ava." The paper felt expensive beneath her fingertips. Nothing like the cheap notebooks Maria had used to write grocery lists or leave morning notes before work. This was different, special, saved for this exact moment. Ava's hands trembled as she turned the envelope over. What truths lay sealed within these pages? For years, she'd built her life around certain beliefs, that Ethan had abandoned them, that her mother had suffered alone, that the Hawthornes were the villains in their story. But the evidence she'd already found hinted at a more complicated truth. "What if I'm wrong about everything?" she whispered to the empty room. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What if the truth hidden in these pages was worse than all the stories she'd told herself? Minutes ticked by on the old wall clock, a remnant from their old apartment that she couldn't bear to leave behind. Finally, with a deep breath, Ava slid her finger under the seal. The paper parted with a soft tear, releasing the scent of aged paper and faded ink. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands, and her mother's words flowed across the page like a river of long-held secrets. My dearest Ava, there are so many things I never told you. So many truths I kept hidden to protect your heart. But you're stronger than I ever was, and you deserve to know everything. I never hated your father. Even when the silence between us stretched into years, even when poverty and hardship wore me down, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. Love doesn't die easily, my darling. Sometimes it just goes quiet. I wrote to him. Every month for years I wrote letters. When you took your first steps, when you said your first word, when you started school, I documented everything. I wanted him to know you, to see the beautiful, fierce girl you were becoming. The letters were returned unopened, or simply disappeared into silence. Now I know why. Augustus made sure they never reached Ethan's hands. But I kept writing, not because I expected answers, but because I needed to believe that someday, somehow, you would find your way to each other. Not for money or status or revenge, but because every child deserves to know where they come from. Every story needs its truth told. You are so much like him, Ava. You have his determination, his sharp mind, his sense of justice. But you also have my fire, my resilience, my ability to survive. You are the best of both of us, and that's why I know you'll understand what I'm about to tell you. Ava paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. Her mother's voice seemed to fill the room, as clear and strong as if she were sitting right beside her. With renewed strength, she reached for the stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. Each envelope told another piece of their story. Maria's elegant handwriting detailed years of struggle, working multiple jobs, stretching every dollar, fighting to keep their tiny apartment warm in winter. But between the lines of hardship ran a current of unwavering hope and love. Ethan, Ava took her first steps today. She's so determined, just like you. She's starting school tomorrow. I wish you could see her in her new dress. The doctor says she'll be fine, but the hospital bills, I don't know how. Page after page of their life, carefully documented and sent into silence. Ava's heart ached for her mother's persistence, her refusal to give up even when no answer came. At the bottom of the stack, she found a different kind of document, her mother's will. The legal paper was crisp and official, listing Maria's modest possessions. But one detail caught Ava's eye, an account number she'd never seen before. Following the trail, she discovered that Maria had done more than just write letters. She'd gathered evidence, newspaper clippings about suspicious Hawthorne business dealings, copies of threatening letters from Augustus, financial records showing patterns of bribery and corruption. Her mother hadn't just been documenting their life, she'd been building a case. For years, Maria had quietly collected proof of Augustus Hawthorne's crimes, storing it away like precious jewels, not for revenge, but for justice. Not just for herself, but for everyone the Hawthornes had hurt in their relentless pursuit of power. Ava spread the evidence across her coffee table, the pieces fitting together like a complex puzzle. Bank statements showed money laundered through shell companies. Letters revealed threats made to journalists who dared investigate the Hawthorne empire. Court documents exposed judges who had been bought and paid for. The truth hit her like a physical force. Her mother hadn't been a victim. She'd been a warrior, fighting a silent battle all these years. And now, she'd passed that fight on to her daughter. With steady hands, Ava reached for her phone. Ethan's number was still saved, though she'd never used it. This time, there was no hesitation when she pressed dial. He answered on the second ring. Ava? Her voice was strong and clear as she said, "Meet me. We're taking them down." The Hawthorne summer house loomed against the darkening sky, its weathered stone facade a testament to decades of secrets kept within its walls. Ava pulled her car onto the overgrown driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The building stood silent and imposing, windows like hollow eyes staring down at her, judging her presence on this hallowed ground. Ethan's black Mercedes was already parked near the entrance. He stood by the front steps, hands tucked into his coat pockets against the evening chill, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. When Ava emerged from her car clutching her mother's documents, his eyes fixed on the weathered papers, recognition and dread flickering across his face. This was his sanctuary, Ethan said quietly as Ava approached. Augustus spent more time here than at the main estate. Said he could think better away from the city. His voice carried a mixture of reverence and resentment. Away from witnesses, you mean? Ava replied, following him up the creaking steps. Each board seemed to protest beneath her feet, as if warning her away. The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing a musty interior frozen in time. Sheets draped the furniture like pale ghosts, and dust motes danced in the beam of Ethan's flashlight. Their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as they made their way to the study, the sound reverberating through empty halls that had once bustled with whispered conspiracies. Here, Ethan said, pulling back a sheet from an old mahogany desk. This is where he worked. His fingers lingered on the polished wood, tracing invisible patterns. Ava laid out the documents one by one, creating a timeline of corruption that spanned decades. Bank statements, threatening letters, court documents, each piece another thread in Augustus Hawthorne's web of deceit. The yellowed papers seemed to breathe with their own life, exhaling long-buried truths. Look at this, she said, pointing to a ledger entry. $300,000 to Judge Harrison, dated 2 weeks before he dismissed the wrongful death lawsuit against Hawthorne Industries. Her finger trembled slightly as it traced the damning figures. Ethan's hands trembled as he examined the evidence. And here, payments to private investigators. The dates match when Maria first tried to contact me. His voice cracked on her mother's name. Page after page revealed Augustus's true nature. Money funneled through shell companies. Journalists silenced with threats or bribes. Politicians bought and paid for like commodities. The paper trail of destruction seemed endless, each document more damning than the last. But it was the last document that made Ethan sink heavily into the dusty chair behind the desk. A letter from Augustus to a known criminal figure, discussing ways to permanently resolve the Maria Monroe situation. The paper shook in his hands. He was going to have her killed, Ethan whispered, his face ashen. My own father. He would have murdered her just to keep his precious reputation intact. Horror etched deep lines around his eyes. Ava watched him carefully. The proud, powerful man she'd first met at the mansion seemed to crumble before her eyes. His shoulders sagged under the weight of revelation, his carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal the wounded son beneath. For a moment, she glimpsed the young man her mother might have loved. I knew he was controlling, Ethan continued, his voice rough. I knew he was cruel. But this... He gestured at the damning evidence spread across his father's desk. This is evil. Pure evil. His hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white with tension. For the first time, Ava saw beyond her own pain to recognize Ethan's. He wasn't the untouchable billionaire anymore, just a man who'd spent his life in the shadow of a monster, trying and failing to measure up to impossible standards. The realization softened something in her chest. I lived my whole life trying to be what he wanted, Ethan said, running a hand through his silver hair. I sacrificed everything, my happiness, my love for your mother, my chance to know you, all to please a man who would have committed murder to protect his image. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. He stood suddenly, determination replacing the defeat in his eyes. If I do one thing right in my life, it will be this. I'll make it right. The conviction in his voice was unmistakable. Ava nodded, gathering the documents. We need to get these to my lawyer tonight with this evidence dash, and the lights, which had been casting a dim glow through the dusty room, went out without warning. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through grimy windows. The sudden blackness felt deliberate, menacing. Power's cut, Ethan said tersely, reaching for his flashlight. We need to leave, now. His tone left no room for argument. They moved quickly through the darkened house, Ethan leading the way with the beam of light. The silence felt heavier now, threatening. When they reached the front door, Ava clutched the documents tighter to her chest, feeling their edges dig into her skin. They stepped out onto the front porch together and immediately froze. 2 black SUVs sat on the gravel driveway, their headlights blazing to life and blinding them. Dark figures emerged from behind the vehicles, their faces hidden in shadow. The night air suddenly felt charged with danger. A familiar voice cut through the night air, smooth and dangerous. "You should have walked away." Reginald Barrett stepped into the space between the headlights, his silver hair gleaming, his smile as cold as the night air around them. He stood like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The SUV's engine hummed as it cut through the darkness, its headlights carving yellow paths through the misty night. In the back seat, Ava sat rigid, her mother's documents clutched tightly against her chest like a shield against what was to come. The worn paper edges dug into her palms, but she welcomed the pain. It kept her focused. Next to her, Ethan's face remained stoic, but his clenched jaw betrayed his tension. His breathing came in measured counts, the only sign of his effort to maintain composure. Two armed men flanked them, their weapons visible reminders of the danger they faced, the metal glinting coldly whenever they passed beneath a streetlight. Through the tinted windows, streetlights blurred past as they left the city behind. The familiar urban landscape gradually gave way to industrial zones and empty lots, each mile taking them further from safety. Rain began to patter against the windshield, creating a rhythmic backdrop to their silent journey, the drops racing down the glass like tears Ava refused to shed. In the front passenger seat, Reginald Barrett's silver head gleamed under passing lights, his perfectly combed hair never moving despite the vehicle's motion. He hadn't spoken since ordering them into the vehicles, but his presence filled the space like a toxic cloud, suffocating and inescapable. Every few minutes, his eyes would meet theirs in the rearview mirror, his satisfaction evident in his cold smile that never quite reached his eyes. The convoy turned onto a poorly lit access road, tires crunching on gravel that popped beneath the heavy wheels. Through the rain-streaked windows, Ava could make out the looming shape of an abandoned warehouse. The building's metal walls rose like dark cliffs against the night sky, its broken windows staring down at them like empty eye sockets, witnesses to countless forgotten secrets. The SUVs pulled up to a loading dock, and rough hands yanked them out into the rain. The cold droplets stung Ava's face as she clutched her mother's papers tighter, protecting them from the downpour. Water dripped from the rusted metal awning above as they were marched through a heavy door that groaned on its hinges. Inside, bare fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor, flickering occasionally as if struggling to stay alive. Their footsteps echoed in the vast space as they were led to two metal chairs placed in the center of the room. The armed men forced them to sit, but didn't bother restraining them. The guns made it clear enough that resistance would be foolish. The cold metal seat bit through Ava's clothes, sending a chill up her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Reginald circled them slowly like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the concrete, the sound bouncing off the warehouse walls in an eerie rhythm. Finally, he stopped in front of them, adjusting his silk tie with manicured fingers that had never known a day of hard work. "You know," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of old money. "I've watched over the Hawthorne legacy for 40 years. Augustus trusted me to protect everything he built." His eyes fixed on Ethan, narrowing slightly, including protecting his son from his own unfortunate choices. Ethan's face darkened, a muscle twitching near his temple. "Maria wasn't a choice. She was the woman I loved," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "Love?" Reginald scoffed, the word dripping with contempt. "What does love matter compared to empire?" Augustus understood that. He knew what had to be done. What had to be done? Ava's voice cracked with barely contained rage, her knuckles white around her mother's papers. "You mean letting my mother die in poverty? Making sure she suffered alone?" Reginald turned to her, his expression one of casual disdain, as if she were an insect not worth the effort to squash. "Your mother was given multiple opportunities to disappear quietly. She chose to be difficult." He shrugged, the gesture almost elegant in its cruelty. Though I must admit, ensuring her letters never reached Ethan was rather entertaining. The hope in her words growing more desperate with each one, until finally they stopped coming. While Reginald talked, Ava's eyes darted around the warehouse, taking in every detail. Two armed men by the main door, their fingers resting too casually on their triggers. Another near a side exit, checking his watch every few minutes. High windows all barred but one with loose fittings. Metal support beams reaching into the shadows above, some with maintenance ladders attached. Her mind worked quickly, mapping escape routes, calculating odds, forming a plan with each passing second. "I've always known about you, of course," Reginald continued, his voice droning like a satisfied cat. "Augustus made sure we monitored the situation. When you started causing trouble, well..." He spread his hands in a gesture of false helplessness. "Here we are." "You're a relic, Reginald." Ethan's voice cut through the air, harder than Ava had ever heard it, stripped of its usual careful restraint. "You and my father, you're dinosaurs. Your time is up." "Is it?" Reginald raised an eyebrow, amusement dancing in his cold eyes. "Look around you, Ethan. Who has the power here? Who controls the situation?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, the expensive paper almost glowing under the harsh lights. "This is a simple document. Sign it and you both walk away. Refuse... His smile turned predatory, revealing teeth too perfect to be real. "Well, abandoned warehouses have a way of keeping secrets." "What's in the document?" Ethan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You'll sign over controlling interest in Hawthorne Industries to me, and you'll legally remove this." He gestured dismissively at Ava, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenient stain. "Person from your will and any claim to the Hawthorne name." Rain drummed against the metal roof, filling the silence that followed, the sound like impatient fingers waiting for their decision. Ava's fingers dug into the arms of her chair as she watched Ethan's face. For a moment she saw him as he must have been decades ago, young, faced with impossible choices, trapped between love and duty, a man on the verge of making a mistake he would spend a lifetime regretting. But this time was different. This time Ethan threw back his head and laughed. The sound bounced off the warehouse walls, startling even the armed men who shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. It carried decades of bitterness, of regret, of anger finally breaking free from its carefully constructed cage. "Do what you have to do," Ethan said when his laughter died away, his voice steel-hard and unflinching, the voice of a man who had finally found his courage. Ava's grip tightened on her chair, her muscles tensed, ready to spring into action at the first opportunity. She wasn't some helpless victim waiting to be saved. She was Maria Monroe's daughter, forged in hardship and determination, and she had survived far worse than Reginald Barrett with his manicured nails and empty threats. The fluorescent lights of the warehouse buzzed overhead as Reginald Barrett's polished shoes clicked against the concrete floor. He approached with a stack of papers, his smug smile reflecting years of getting away with everything. Ava's wrists burned from the rough rope, but she kept her face neutral, hiding the fact that she'd been working on a piece of broken glass she'd spotted on the floor earlier. "Sign here, Ethan," Reginald said, laying out the documents on a rusty metal table, "and all this unpleasantness goes away." Ethan sat in his chair, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where one of the guards had struck him. His expensive suit was torn and dirty, but his eyes burned with a fire Ava had never seen before. "You won't get away with this," Ethan said quietly. Reginald laughed, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls. "I've gotten away with far worse, my boy. Your father taught me well." While they talked, Ava worked the glass shard against her bonds. Her palms were sweaty, and she had to be careful not to let the glass slip. One wrong move and she'd cut herself instead of the rope. She could feel the fibers starting to give way. "You killed her, didn't you?" Ava asked, keeping Reginald's attention on her face rather than her hands. "You made sure my mother never got the medical care she needed." "My dear," Reginald's voice dripped with condescension, "people like your mother die every day. It's the natural order of things." The rope snapped. Ava kept her hands behind her back, waiting for the right moment. She counted 4 armed guards, all focused on Ethan and the documents. "Sign it." Reginald pushed the papers toward Ethan. "Or this ends badly for both of you." Ava chose that moment to move. She launched herself from the chair, her muscles screaming from being bound for so long. The nearest guard didn't even have time to turn before she slammed into him. Her hands found his gun and they crashed to the floor together. "Stop her," Reginald shouted, but Ethan was already moving too. Despite his age, Ethan tackled Reginald with surprising force. They tumbled into the metal table, sending papers flying everywhere. The remaining guards raised their weapons, but Ava had already wrested control of the first guard's gun. "Drop them," she commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Gunfire erupted. One of the guards shot at her, but Ava had already rolled behind a stack of crates. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Ethan grunt in pain. Suddenly, security alarms began blaring throughout the warehouse. Red emergency lights started flashing, casting eerie shadows across the concrete floor. The guards looked around in confusion. "What is that?" Reginald demanded, shoving Ethan away from him. The answer came in the form of screeching tires outside. Through the warehouse windows, multiple vehicles could be seen pulling up, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "That would be James," Ethan said, wiping blood from his lip. "He always did have good timing." Reginald's face contorted with rage. He turned to run, but Ava was faster. She stepped out from behind the crates and blocked his path, the gun trained steadily on his chest. "This is for my mother," she said, her voice ice cold. Police officers flooded into the warehouse, their weapons drawn. Ava kept her gun on Reginald until an officer approached to take him into custody. Only then did she lower the weapon, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. James appeared through the chaos, looking as composed as ever despite the situation. He carried a thick envelope. "I took the liberty of making copies of all the evidence," he said, handing it to one of the detectives. "You'll find everything you need to prosecute Mr. Barrett, including his involvement in Maria Monroe's death." Reginald struggled against the handcuffs as officers led him away. "You have no idea what you've done," he shouted. "The system will never accept you." Ava watched as they pushed him into a police car, his expensive suit now wrinkled and dirty. After all these years, after all the pain and loss, justice was finally being served. The warehouse slowly emptied as police collected evidence and took statements. Ava stepped outside, needing to feel the night air on her face. The city sprawled before her, its lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth. This was her city too, she realized. No one could take that away from her now. She heard footsteps behind her and knew it was Ethan before he spoke. He stood beside her, his face bruised but his eyes clear and determined. "It's over," he said quietly. Ava took a deep breath of the cool night air. "No," she replied. "It's just beginning." The mahogany doors of courtroom 7A swung open, revealing a sea of expensive suits and designer dresses. Camera flashes erupted as Ava Monroe walked down the center aisle, her head held high despite the weight of countless stares. Her navy blue blazer and pencil skirt were modest but sharp, a deliberate choice to show she belonged in these halls of power. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations and the rustle of reporters' notepads. Every major news outlet had fought for a seat. This wasn't just any trial. It was the unraveling of one of America's most powerful dynasties. Ava took her place beside her attorney, Sarah Chen, a fierce litigator known for taking down corporate giants. Under the polished oak table, Ava's hands curled into tight fists, her knuckles white with tension. She could feel Reginald Barrett's icy stare from across the room. He sat there in his orange jumpsuit, handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights, but somehow he still managed to look imperious. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his posture rigid with aristocratic disdain. The handcuffs seemed almost like an accessory rather than a restraint. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber. Judge Eleanor Martinez entered, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. Case number 2021 CR 789, the state versus Reginald Barrett, she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. "You may be seated." The prosecutor, David Thompson, approached the podium. His opening statement laid out the charges: corruption spanning decades, fraud that had destroyed countless lives, and the recent attempted coercion of Ethan and Ava Hawthorne. When Ethan was called to the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. The once powerful CEO looked different now, humbled, but somehow stronger. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight of truth he carried. "Mr. Hawthorne," Thompson began, "please tell the court about your father's relationship with the defendant." Ethan's voice was steady as he spoke. "Reginald Barrett was more than my father's friend. He was his enforcer. When something needed to be buried, Reginald handled it." "And what needed to be buried, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Everything." Ethan's eyes met Ava's briefly. "The letters from Maria Monroe telling me she was pregnant, the records of illegal donations to judges, the bribes paid to keep investigations quiet." He paused, his voice growing heavier. "My father built his empire on corruption, and Reginald Barrett was his architect." The gallery erupted in whispers. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reginald's lawyer, Maxwell Wright, objected repeatedly, but the judge overruled him each time. "Your Honor," Wright argued during cross-examination, "my client was merely following orders as a corporate officer." "Following orders?" Ethan's voice cut through the courtroom. "He chose to destroy lives. He chose to keep me from knowing about my own daughter." Wright turned his attention to attacking Ava's credibility. He painted her as a calculated opportunist, suggesting she had orchestrated the entire situation to claim the Hawthorne fortune. "Isn't it convenient," Wright sneered, "that you appeared just when the Hawthorne empire was at its most vulnerable?" Ava remained composed, her voice clear and unwavering. "I came looking for answers about my mother. The truth about your client's crimes found me." The moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Sarah Chen approached the bench with a sealed evidence box, Maria Monroe's hidden legacy. "Your Honor," Chen began, "we submit into evidence documents recovered from Maria Monroe's personal effects." The judge carefully examined each piece, detailed financial records showing millions in bribes, correspondence proving systematic corruption, and finally, a notarized confession from Janet Williams, former head of human resources at Hawthorne Industries. "I was paid $50,000 to destroy all records of Maria Monroe's employment," the confession read. "Mr. Barrett personally handed me the check and told me it never happened." Reginald's facade finally cracked. His face turned ashen as the judge reviewed the documents. His hands trembled slightly, the first sign of weakness he'd shown. The prosecution rested their case. The defense's arguments felt hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. When Judge Martinez called for her final ruling, the courtroom fell silent. "In all my years on the bench," she began, "I have rarely seen such a calculated and prolonged abuse of power. Mr. Barrett, you have betrayed not just the law, but the very principles of human decency." She adjusted her glasses, looking directly at Reginald. "I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate dissolution of the current Hawthorne Industries Board of Directors." The judge turned to Ava. "Ms. Monroe, as the DNA evidence confirms your status as Ethan Hawthorne's daughter, and in light of his testimony supporting your claim, I hereby recognize you as the legal heir to the Hawthorne estate." The gavel struck with finality. Cameras flashed as Reginald was led away by court officers. Board members hurried out, already on their phones to their lawyers. Reporters scrambled to be the first to break the story. Ava stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. She had won. Not just for herself, but for her mother. For every person the Hawthorne empire had ever silenced. When she turned, she found Ethan watching her. Gone was the powerful CEO, the distant billionaire. In his place stood just a father, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride, regret, and desperate hope for forgiveness. He didn't move toward her or speak. He simply waited, letting her decide what came next. The autumn breeze rustled through the manicured gardens of the Hawthorne estate as Ava stood at the wrought iron gates, her hand resting on the cold metal. The mansion loomed before her, its limestone facade catching the morning light. 3 weeks had passed since the trial, but everything felt different now. The intimidating structure that had once represented everything she despised now belonged to her, yet she felt uncertain about claiming it. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she made her way up the circular driveway. James had maintained the gardens meticulously. Roses still bloomed despite the cooling weather, their deep red petals a stark contrast against the weathered stone walls. Ava paused to touch one of the blooms, remembering how her mother had always loved roses but could never afford them. The massive oak door opened before she could reach for it. Ethan stood in the doorway, his tall frame slightly stooped, as if carrying an invisible weight. He had aged in the past few weeks, more silver threading through his dark hair, new lines etched around his eyes. But there was something different about him too, a softness that hadn't been there before. "You came," he said simply, his voice carrying both surprise and relief. Ava nodded, following him into the grand foyer. The marble floors echoed their footsteps, and the morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the space. Everything gleamed with wealth and history, but now Ava saw beyond the surface shine. She saw the cost of all this luxury, paid for with silenced voices and buried truths. Ethan led her to his study where a leather briefcase sat open on his desk. Without ceremony, he pulled out a thick envelope and a ring of keys. "Everything that's mine is yours," he said, holding them out to her. "The estate, the company shares, all of it. It's your birthright." Ava looked at the offering, her heart beating against her ribs. The keys felt heavy in her palm when she finally took them, each one representing a different piece of the Hawthorne empire. The envelope contained transfer documents, stock certificates, property deeds, paper proof of power. "I don't know if I want it," she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. Instead of responding, Ethan gestured for her to follow him. They walked through the mansion's corridors, their footsteps echoing off marble floors and wood-paneled walls. Generations of Hawthorne men stared down at them from gilded frames, stern faces, cold eyes, expressions of entitled authority. Augustus Hawthorne's portrait dominated the main hall. Ava stopped before it, studying the face of the man who had tried to erase her existence. His eyes seemed to follow her, judging, disapproving. But she was beyond his reach now. "This legacy," Ava said, gesturing to the portraits, "it was built on silencing people like my mother." Ethan stood beside her, his shoulders tense. "Yes, then it needs to change." Over the next hour, Ava outlined her vision. She would sell most of the Hawthorne shares, but not to other corporations or wealthy investors. Instead, the money would fund scholarships for underprivileged students and provide capital for Black-owned businesses. The mansion itself would become a historical landmark, but not to celebrate the Hawthorne name. It would tell the stories of the invisible people who had built this wealth, the housekeepers, gardeners, and workers whose lives had been shaped by the dynasty's power. "The company stays under our control," she explained, "not because I want the power, but because I need to make sure no one like your father ever controls it again." Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't argue or try to convince her otherwise. Instead, relief seemed to wash over him, as if a burden he'd carried for decades was finally lifting. "You're right," he said simply. "This is what needs to happen." They spent the rest of the morning in the garden, sitting on an old stone bench near Maria's favorite roses. The conversation between them was quiet, hesitant. Not the easy flow of a typical father and daughter, but not the tense silence of enemies either. They were something in between, trying to find their way forward. The sun had climbed high in the sky when Ethan finally asked the question that had been weighing on him since the trial. "Will you ever forgive me?" Ava watched a butterfly land on one of the roses, its wings catching the light. She thought about her mother's letters, about years of silence, about choices made and unmade. She thought about the man sitting beside her, not the powerful CEO or the coward who had let her mother go, but someone trying to make amends. "Maybe one day," she said finally. She stood up, smoothing her jacket. She wasn't leaving as a Hawthorne, claiming a dynasty's power. She was walking forward as herself. Ava Monroe, her mother's daughter, ready to rewrite the story on her own terms. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Ava, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Ava, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.